the pleasure of being the co-chair of the GLE Substance Use and Addictions Leadership Collaborative, alongside my co-chair, Lindsay Fortune from Auckland, New Zealand. For those of you who may not have heard of GLE, the acronym stands for Global Leadership Exchange. There are 13 member countries, and it is free to join. You will be able to see a QR code on your screen shortly to enable you to do that easily. And of course, you as attendees are also from all around the world. Please feel free to use the chat function to introduce your name and where you are zooming in from. And I see we have a few already introducing themselves, and hello, everyone. Today's webinar marks a special occasion for the Substance Use and Addictions Leadership Collaborative. The collaborative established almost 4 years ago and is growing. The collaborative is also free to join, and contact details are found within the GLE website. Our webinar, Breaking the Algorithms, Something for Everyone, is no doubt of interest to all of us, whether we work in mental health, disability, or substance use and addictions. The topic came very organically from our collaborative and from discussions, as many of us have been experiencing challenges, both professionally with those that we might be working with or supporting, and also professionally with how algorithms are operating in all of our lives. So let's open a discussion led by experts to support and empower us all. Before I introduce our speakers, we will review our agenda and take care of some housekeeping. On your screen momentarily, you will see our format for today. First, we will be having Professor Kara present, followed by Dr. Makande. Next, we will have an opportunity for them to ask each other questions and further the discussion, followed by an opening of Q&A for all of us to join in. Please click on the bottom for the Q&A, which is at the bottom of the screen, to ask questions of the speakers, and we will do our best to get these answered by the speakers after the presentation. The presenter slides will not be made available after the webinar. However, a link to the webinar recordings will be made available on the GLE website. So without further ado, I introduce our first speaker, Professor Nicholas Kara from Queensland University, Australia. You would have seen Nick's bio when you registered. Of his many achievements, Nick has also successfully engaged with policymakers in Australia and internationally about the use of digital media by alcohol marketers. Thank you for joining us today, Professor Kara.
Thanks, Greg, and hello to everyone. It's wonderful to join you. I wanted to begin something just by saying something about the background. The background image is an artwork called A Guidance Through Time, created by Kondamuka artists Casey Coolwell and Kyra Mangchalal for the University of Queensland. And I want to acknowledge their work and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm presenting from this evening, the Yagara and Turrbal people. Pay my respects to their elders past and present and their continuing connections to country. Just give me a moment, I'll share my screen. There we go, just wait. There, you should be seeing my screen now. I wanted to do a talk tonight that thought about algorithms in a couple of ways. I was going to begin by situating it really in some current events and current debates, and then moving to think about platforms. And by platforms here, I really mean big digital and social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, and how they've created a particular kind of algorithmic culture over the last several decades. And often when we're thinking about algorithms and what they're doing in their lives, I think what we're often talking about is those platforms and their business models and their technological projects. So I wanted to kind of start here by speaking to some of the contemporary debate, and particularly this debate has taken on an intensive kind of character in Australia, but I think in many parts of the world. I have two screenshots. One, of course, is from The Atlantic and the essay from Jonathan Haidt on his about his book, really about as he says in the headline there, end the phone-based childhood now. A kind of really strident, compelling account of the way that phones and the use of smartphones and the algorithmic models that shape the feeds of information on them have affected children and their mental health and well-being. And really kind of really specifically putting the blame, if you like, on phones for the kind of crises that kids are facing. And in many ways, we might say that the concerns we have about young people, I think, are also concerns that many of us have about ourselves and many groups of people in our societies, their kind of vulnerabilities to these forms of technology. Um, I think that there's a real debate about this debate, of course, because the rise of the smartphone also coincides with the rise of a lot of other things, much more precarious livelihoods, precarious forms of employment, and of course, much more supervised and controlled forms of childhood as well. But in this country, where I'm speaking from, Australia, what we're seeing the government do over the past year is firstly legislate a ban on under 16s using social media platforms, and now throughout this year working out how they're going to do that. They announced today that the ban will take effect on December 10, and they've released some guidelines for how digital platforms, so and they particularly here they designate Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Snapchat, and so on, will need to ban young people from using those services. So I think here there's a really interesting set of issues that are unfolding where what you have is the public, governments, civil society, public health experts all feeling that there's something really going on here in terms of the way that technologies, and particularly the kinds of technologies that we're engaging with via our smartphones, the social media platforms, the digital services we're using, are affecting our moods, our well-being, our livelihoods in all sorts of ways, and we need to kind of respond to that somehow. I want to kind of step back from this kind of immediate link, if you like, between algorithms being somehow harmful to people or generating kind of addictive or compulsive kinds of behaviors, and think about how instead other ways we might think about this, and particularly kind of how we got here. And the story that I want to trace is one that really comes from my background as a researcher. I work not in the behavioral sciences, but in the humanities, where my discipline is really the discipline of media and cultural studies, where we're interested in how people really use media as part of the kind of practices of living their lives. And how their kind of uses of media are often then kind of colliding or tangled with the really powerful corporate interests that control our media cultures. So I want to kind of make this sort of a claim that digital media platforms, and by that I really mean the kind of big social media platforms, um, have built over the last couple of decades a business model that is really designed to optimize our attention. What they want us to do is kind of stay in those platforms, scrolling in our feeds for as long as possible, because that means they can sell us more advertising, we can consume more entertainment content, and so on. So their whole kind of effort, if you like, over the last couple of decades has been to kind of generate a business model and a set of technologies that keep us tuned into their feeds. And in many ways, I think, we could look at the way television tried to do this in the late 20th century. We can look at how, particularly speaking from Australia, how the poker machine tried to do this, by designing kind of forms of gameplay on the poker machine that keeps people tuned in and gambling for as long as possible. So there are kind of antecedent technologies where a mixture of kind of content and data was being tuned to kind of keep people attached for as long as possible and in, as we say, a kind of endless feed or an endless scroll of content. Why were they doing that? Well, they were doing that because as the internet developed and commercialized from the late 90s onwards, advertising became really central to the business model of web services and digital businesses that were emerging. And really, if you go right back, I have on here a little screenshot from, earlier forms of Windows referencing the cookie. And the cookie is kind of where this all begins. And the cookie was created to solve what developers called the shopping cart problem, which was if people were going to start shopping online, then as they moved around online stores, you had to have a way as they went from page to page for the website to remember what items they had kind of put in their shopping basket. So when they got to the checkout, all their items were there for them to buy in a single bundle. And so the cookie was kind of a little piece of code that would get embedded in an individual's browser and would enable the website to kind of follow them as they moved around the website. And then that kind of, creates the light bulb moment of, wait a second, if we can follow people so we can watch what they put in their shopping basket, what else could we do by following them? And that's where you start to get the digital advertising business, which from that early kind of display advertising now is an extremely kind of sophisticated machinery. And I want to say something about um, how the ad model of the business now works, of these big businesses now works. What you see on screen is a little screenshot from Meta. So Meta owns Facebook and Instagram, and it's inside their ad buying tool where you're being asked here to create an ad and to select what kind of audience you want. So this is kind of choosing what audience building tool. And the custom audience is an audience where you might have a list of customers that you've kind of collected through your website. You feed them into Meta, and Meta goes and finds them and targets them. But the lookalike audience is the one that's really powerful and what drives a lot of the advertising that we see on our feeds today. Meta are now calling the lookalike audience also Advantage Plus. And the idea behind this kind of advertising tool is that you don't really need to know anything about your customers or your preferred audience at all. You simply buy an ad, post it on the platform, and it starts to watch who engages with it. And then it shows it to people who look like the people who are interested in your ad, and it builds your audience outwards from there. What the model is trying to learn all the time in terms of the ads we see and the content we see in our feeds is who is proximate to who. So whose patterns of kind of scrolling and dwelling and staying in the feed are similar to other kinds of users. And so if you like these patterns of content and they keep you on the platform, then we'll show other people who are kind of like you similar patterns of content to keep them on the platform. So this is the whole kind of logic that starts to develop as the um, digital industries really tune in, if you like, to this problem and focus their attention on this problem of how to keep people scrolling. And then, of course, the answer is algorithmic models. So it's kind of interesting to go back and think about when Facebook and Instagram and YouTube started to move from what we might think of as a chronological feed of content to an algorithmic feed of content. And what they were kind of doing is moving away from just showing us things in the order that they were posted on platforms to instead showing us or showing us content that was based on what we were engaging with. And often and still conducting all sorts of experiments with our feeds. And I just kind of want to point out that a lot of this feels new, but in some ways it's quite old. I have on screen here a news story from 2014, Facebook's infamous mood experiment, where they took 600,000 users, split them into groups A and B, showed one group more happy content, one group more negative content for a week, and watched how that changed their patterns of engagement. And they found that, certain kinds of content with elevated moods kept people scrolling for longer, and that's the kind of content they should privilege in people's feeds. So a real kind of effort to learn how to tune into our feelings, our moods, our affects as a way to keep us on platforms. To do this, they've had to build more and more sophisticated machine vision models. And I want to say something about how those models work and how they've really dramatically changed over the last 10 years or so. Um, I just want to maybe create this small distinction between what we might think of as supervised and unsupervised forms of machine learning. And this was a kind of critical shift that began to unfold a decade ago with the emergence of large neural networks. A supervised machine learning model is a much more simple learning model where you, the developer of the model, are able to write and code in the instructions. So these models were very good for, say, recognizing car number plates. In the little graphic I have on the screen, you can tell a model exactly what the rules are for identifying an A and a T because they look the same way every time. But culture and our lives are not like that. They're full of much more messy, much more emergent kind of symbols. So on the right, I have handwriting. You really can't write a set of instructions on how to recognize every A in that because they're all slightly different. And so the shift to the question of how to recognize our open-ended cultural expressions, what we put in our images and so on, really depended on the creation of unsupervised models that could just learn the patterns of our lives and then learn to follow us. And that really only became possible when you got the connecting together of a number of things by digital platforms like Google and like Facebook, because they had all of a sudden extremely large unstructured data sets of text and images. They, in order to make their platforms work at a global scale, it created a kind of computational infrastructure of server farms and processing power that had never really existed before. And they had the money to test out some theories of machine learning that had been around for a very long time, but no one really had the computational power or the data to really test the models. And so they really then began to feed enormous amounts of information about us that we posted to platforms to these models to kind of learn the patterns of social life and learn how to follow them in order to keep us scrolling, linking, liking, tagging, and so on. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here because I only have so much time. But as we kind of move through the past decade, the models that are sitting underneath the kinds of digital and social media platforms we're using know an enormous amount about us without us having to kind of explicitly label and describe what we're doing. So this is one experiment that we did with Instagram images where we fed 30,000 images that young people had posted from a music festival and let a model go and create its own visual language of the festival. And one of the things we found it was really good at doing was finding groups of festival goers, in this case, groups of young women who are posing in their outfits, but also all holding a red cup that's, of course, synonymous with alcohol. And the model could easily spot certain kinds of poses and the cup and so on. And so our kind of social lives, the way we document them on social media platforms, become very, very visible and very intelligible to digital platforms. Some of the work we're doing in Australia, and the work like this is happening elsewhere in the world, is to create what we call data or internet observatories. That is an effort to create a new kind of civil society institution where researchers, the public, government can work with people to donate data about their digital lives that helps us kind of understand what's happening for them on digital platforms and how models are targeting them. And I want to conclude with a couple of examples related specifically to advertising. So in a big study we're doing at the moment called the Australian Ad Observatory, we're asking people to donate to us the advertisements that they're seeing in their digital feeds. And we're looking for the kinds of patterns in the ads that they see over time. And so what we're beginning to understand is that algorithmic models are creating very different pathways and journeys, if you like, or sequences of ads through our digital feeds over time. So this might be the pattern of ads that I see, this might be the pattern of ads you see, this might be the pattern of ads your friend sees, and so on. Our experience of our digital feeds is ubiquitous in one sense. As we're all scrolling, we all have a shared experience of it, but all of our feeds look different as models start to tune toward us. In the case of some commodities, this creates really interesting and concerning effects. So one of the commodities I'm particularly interested in is alcohol. And what we begin to see is that alcohol looks very different in different kinds of people's feeds. So this is a group of young women in a study we're doing, and we noticed that their alcohol ads were often kind of very pink, very full of kind of lifestyle information, the context of consumption, very social forms of consumption. Whereas young men see very different kinds of ads. This is not an alcohol example, this is a gambling example. But young men see, in the same study, they were seeing very bright ads with very calculative, strong language like make it count, $2 lines at every game, respect the game, fuel your morning, where the kind of narratives and aesthetics of their feeds look very different to their peers who are young women, for example. We also see different people get different kinds of alcohol ads in sort of where they are in the purchase chain. So people who are kind of high volume consumers of alcohol see lots of catalog style advertising with a certain kind of price point, whereas different kinds of consumers see, on the left here is a woman in her 20s with very kind of pastel, healthy lifestyle kind of ads, alcohol woven into that in very subtle ways. The person in the middle, an older consumer who's seeing very kind of catalog oriented advertising. And so the model has kind of learned to differentiate and to sort between certain kinds of consumers and so serve them different kinds of content. And my final point, because I realize I'm just about out of time here, is to say the other thing that we're seeing happen in these algorithmic models is a joining together of the content and the ads with the retail. So every ad we see in our feeds now is a kind of tappable button where we can sort of buy now, shop now, deliver now. And in the case of addictive commodities like alcohol, that means, in many countries, the ads you're seeing that are targeted very directly to you can then tap you through to an on-demand delivery service that'll have that alcohol delivered to your door very quickly. So the kind of layers of harm here when we're thinking about algorithmic models, are not just sort of how they might be shaping our mood, but how they might be like tuning into our vulnerabilities and shaping our life choices in ways that are often very subtle and hard for us to appreciate, because we really can't compare. I can't compare my algorithmic feed to your algorithmic feed. We live in a kind of a bubble of our own in many respects. I think I've well and truly used my 15 minutes. So I'll pause there, and I'm kind of looking forward to the discussion.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Professor Kara. We will have questions and discussion after the next presentation. Uh, it's a pleasure to now introduce our second speaker, Dr. Elena Makonde from Germany. You will have seen her bio when you registered. An interesting fact is that her PhD thesis was on exploring pathways to deviant and conformist behaviors in cyberspace. Thank you so much, Dr. Makonde, for joining us here today.
Yeah, many thanks, Greg. I hope you can all hear me all right. Yeah, I'm about to share my slides, but just to give you a brief introduction. So I'm splitting my time working both as a psychodynamic psychotherapist. So I'm really trained in a psychoanalytic method. So you will also find this as a voice in my presentation. And I'm also a professor for psychology here in Germany. So share my screen. Okay, lovely. So I will today primarily talk about social media, talk about current trends, talk about how these manifest in the treatment of addiction and treatments of clients in general, especially of the younger generation. But as for my research, I'm also interested in gaming, for example, and in the links between cyber deviance and also mental health and online addiction. So I will give you a brief introduction into the topic, then move on specific to excessive social media consumption, and also bring in a couple of therapeutic implications that I see in my practice. So I'm working in an addiction center as a therapist, and as I have specialized, especially in young people with behavioral addictions, I'm seeing a lot of internet-related psychopathology. And I just will speak from experience in this section. So just to give you a brief intro, we talk about many different things when we talk about pathological internet use. So as of now, we will primarily speak about gaming disorder, about excessive social media use, excessive online shopping, and also problematic online pornography usage. However, this is by no means like a complete list because we have, due to the rapid technological development, really all kinds of emerging behaviors as well, also new kinds of cyber deviance. You may be familiar with this, but for me, the newest thing is people, especially young adults, using ChatGPT as kind of surrogate therapist by using its diary function and feeding it with, their daily events in a way, and also expecting some kind of therapeutic response. And I find myself as of now often competing with ChatGPT's answers and attitudes. And of course, ChatGPT is usually much more attuned to the individual client than I would be as a different human being. So I never expected to be competing with robots or artificial intelligence in terms of therapy, but now we're there. As Nick really demonstrated so skillfully, there's also a huge influence of politics and industry, especially if we talk about online addiction. I guess there is really a reason why, as so far, we only have gaming disorder as a standalone diagnoses, really, and everything else is somehow, still neglected by the DSM, also by the ICD-11, and but also gaming disorder. The introduction of the gaming disorder diagnosis was also very controversial, and the industry has really put a lot of money, into research and into lobbyism, trying to propagate that gaming, is really just recreational and healthy and doesn't carry any danger at all. And of course, when it comes to therapy, I think an issue that is often overlooked is also that we have intergenerational conflicts between clients and between therapists. So I don't know where you see yourself here, but usually we have this division between the Gen X, which we would label the digital immigrants, the Gen Y, to which I belong, which is kind of like the sandwich generation. So we have grown up still without the internet, but it was introduced very early in our lives. And then the Generation Z, the young adults now, which we call digital natives, or Gen I. And what I observe in my clinical practice is that often when we are therapists from Gen X and Gen Y, it's not naturally given for us to inquire about online usage, online consumption patterns, time spent with devices, in general with our client. It is often something that's overlooked, something that we probably also don't understand quite as well as they do, who have grown up with it. But online addiction or screen addiction is certainly nothing that's just limited to the Gen Z, right? The generation per se doesn't tell us anything about online consumption patterns. There are also different kinds of immigrants. Some embrace a new culture wholeheartedly, whereas others struggle a lot with it. So that by itself is not very informative, to be fair. We see plenty of societal changes at the moment. I really love Nick's part about pointing out especially the macro societal changes, but we also see this on an individual level. So it is just to say from a scientific point of view that as of now, there's a whole generation out there, the Gen Z generation, that's simply wired differently. I'm talking neurology here. So we do see different EEG patterns in these young people than, for example, my generation has, or even the previous generation has. This is mainly due to a constant hyperarousal associated with technology. We see that young people are very much focused on external stimuli instead of internal stimuli. And we know from MRI and EEG studies that it's especially the anticipatory joy circles in our brains that fire when we use online tech, right? So this is pretty much the same circuit that you will find in any behavioral addiction. So unlike substances, it's not about the effect that you actually get when consuming. It's more this anticipatory feeling, the joy, the excitement about it, and makes it so seductive. And that's a great difference compared to substances. Of course, there are also certain characteristics about the technology itself. So I'm talking about our devices here, which we probably all have, but also about the content that we see online. So there are two levels here. Both of them have their affordances and something that we in media studies like to call a certain stickiness, which might result from the anonymity about it, the accessibility, the ubiquity that it has. As Nick pointed out, the design is really also built to seduce. He's already let you in on the secret that no software developer in the world, aims to design an application that is, say, moderately interesting and which people check, maybe once a week. Nobody wants to do that. They are designed to get us hooked, designed to seduce us. And I'm talking, about the devices, but also about the content. Virtually nothing, for example, about our smartphones is just there arbitrarily. Everything is designed purposefully, from the sounds that they make, from the visual channels that are being addressed by it. So they're really seductive by design. And I think we can say, for example, that smartphones in themselves aren't just mere devices. They are something like social companions. They are entities to which we have transferences and counter-transferences, right? They have an emotional importance to us. And we're not even talking content here. That's just the device itself. So I would now like to move on to excessive social media consumption and also the research that I've done into this topic. So as for social media and young adults, in Germany, where my practice is, we know from studies that young adults spend about 224 minutes daily on them, which is a lot. Like if you do the math, that comes down to several hours. We know that these have negative psychological consequences. I mean, there's also something at the moment that we see in the current Gen I or Gen Z, that they often find it hard to become independent. We call this a failure to launch syndrome. A lot of them stay at home for a long time, have struggles moving out, have troubles, starting their professional lives. And so in the research that we did, we were interested in whether social media consumption would somehow be linked to overall autonomy or lack of autonomy in young adults. This is kind of intuitive. It makes sense, I guess, because social media really hampers user autonomy. I mean, we've seen this in the previous talk as well. They collect our user data with echo chambers. They also hamper our user autonomy. There's certainly the fear of missing out that's also, explicitly targeted by the content that we see there. And as we've just seen, there's also a huge problem with dark ads, and also something that we call hostile dependency, especially in addiction research. When you are, feel you have to have a certain technology, and that is certainly true. Try to board a plane or buy a train ticket without a smartphone. It is hard, it is increasingly hard to live without one. At the same time, it isn't a very, friendly or generous technology at the same time. For something that, has previously been invented to serve humanity, you could really wonder what the power dynamics are, as we speak today. So, we wondered whether social media can sort of be the culprit for decreasing autonomy that we find in the general population of young adults. We can say that about 2 to 6% of the general population and 15% of adolescents, I mean, that's a lot, probably fulfill the criteria for screen addiction. So in this research, we really found that higher social media consumption significantly correlated with a lack of autonomy in young adults. So it really hampered not only user autonomy, but also general autonomy, especially when it came to young people making up their own mind about things, having own opinions, having their own emotional reactions to things. These were things that were strongly hampered the more social media they used. And of course, it makes sense, because if we think about what they see online, I mean, you have here dark advertisement. This is probably one of the most scandalous, most known kinds of dark ads that were online on Facebook. This is the Dove Real Beauty campaign. I guess the racism speaks pretty much for itself when you look at it. So it's not, officially commissioned or approved advertisement produced by companies, which nonetheless we see, individually, every one of us do. And I think what's especially problematic about advertisement on social media platforms is that often advertisement is not labeled as such, and also not regulated. When you think about, back in the 90s, when we would still indulge in, television and watch, say, the movie that came at 8 p.m., and you would have your ad breaks, but it was clear that this was advertisement, and it was labeled advertisement, and it was also regulated. Whereas now, when people watch, say, videos or reels, anything produced by influencers, this is also advertisement, but it's not clearly marked as advertisement. It resembles more, an idea as if life itself is a product that's advertised here. And I think this is especially problematic because most time people will take this for reality. And I see many young clients who, openly claim they wish they would like to have the life of an influencer, and actually think that this is quite real what they see there, and this is reality for them. And of course, this is also because social media is working with so many visual cues as well. And, as a species, we're just very prone to fall for them in the first place. And I think that also adds to the stickiness to some degree. So now we'll come to the therapeutic implications. If you are a practitioner, I don't know, maybe you may have encountered the same thing. I would say I have something like an Instagram countertransference with clients, especially with young people. When I talk to them and I find them very shallow, and they have very lack of depth, they have this pop psychology vocabulary. I don't know about the place where you are at right now, but in Germany, it's really quite hip at the moment to talk about trigger points and things that are toxic and things that are narcissistic without people actually knowing what this term actually relates to. There's very little room for the ambivalence, I think, that's quite inherent in life, as well as the tragic component that I feel is also very inherent in life. So in transference-based psychotherapy, or coming from Melanie Klein, we would actually call this the paranoid schizoid disposition. So where things are basically split between you either being in heaven or in hell, but there's very little capacity to actually bring these two together, and have a more realistic worldview. And also the feeling of gluttony. That's also something I come across quite often, especially when talking to young people. As soon as they leave my office, I usually find myself extremely hungry, or craving for something that I can't even put my finger on. And I think this is also something that that especially social media consumption leaves us with. So this is what I have labeled my Instagram countertransference. You will see the very hungry caterpillar here. She's one of my more vocal clients, actually. She used to refer to herself as the very hungry caterpillar. In Germany, interestingly, the title translates to the insatiable caterpillar. And she also had a social media addiction, and that was certainly also a topic of hers. So I've brought with me also some, I thought, illustrative quotes from clients of mine. So these are questions, I would ask them quite frequently in these sessions. Have you ever considered deleting your Instagram account? Especially when people say, I know it doesn't do me any good. But at the same time, and that's where we see the hostile dependency, they would answer impossible. That would be like not existing. It is as if I wasn't there and the world would move on without me. So you see several, topics in here. The fear of missing out, also an existential threat, by deleting is almost as if you would get rid of your own identity to some degree. I also like to ask, what would happen? Say if you do something, if you went on a trip and you didn't create a post about it. And I'm often surprised how many clients say, well, that would be as if it hadn't happened at all, as if the memory had been wiped out. That's almost as if social media consumption is like this instant gratification, not just I'm alive, but also I've experienced something, and without that gratification is negligible. So so I just wanted to give my clients, of course, a voice as well, because I've learned a lot from them and still do. So if there are a few things you take away from this talk, please let it be this. If you work as a practitioner, please ask about media usage. Can't do anything wrong with that. Ask them how much time they spend at their phones. If they have sleeping disorders, do they switch them off at night? Are they in their bedrooms? What content do they use? What is it that they find so intriguing about it? Just ask, really. Please ask, regardless of age, profession, etc. It's quite wrong, as with as all addiction professionals know, to assume that simply because somebody is educated or somebody has a certain age, this won't be an issue for them. I would even go as far as saying that my stepmother is more into iTag than I am, for example. Consider using psychometric tests. There are a couple of them out there, also in English language, also freely available. If you don't have the time to do long, anamnestic processes, you can always hand out questionnaires as sort of an intro when clients come in. And I would also like to encourage you about really exploring relationships and the transferences that people have with both the devices and the content. For example, through such questions as, what does it do to you? Why do you use it? Why is it so intriguing? What do you think would be missing if you didn't have it? Honestly, you'll be surprised, if you open up the door, a lot of it will come through it, that I can promise you. But I think it's really mandatory for us as therapists to have this in mind and to talk about this. Is such a vital part, especially of young people's lives, that it would be a gross mistake not to ask about it. So that would be really my key takeaway position. And of course, you can also question your own screen usage. It's an interesting topic in a way, because we all usually have smartphones and use screen media at some point in our lives. And so, you know, there may also be more resistance amongst ourselves, you know, about critically asking, you know, the relationship we have with these things. So if you have any further questions, comments, if you'd like to discuss research, whatever, please feel free to reach out. This is an email address that should work, and by which I can be contacted rather easily. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Makande. Wow. So we would now like to invite you both to further the discussion and ask each other questions, and comment on each other's presentations. And then we will open it up for general Q&A from the group.
Nick, can I start bombarding you with my questions? Yeah, I mean, first of all, thank you so much for giving us this, you know, wider perspective and things. And here in Germany, of course, we have, or in Europe in general, we are looking at Australia right now with a lot of curiosity about how the social media ban is going to play out. And I hope it's okay to ask you your personal opinion about this, you know, how it has gone to legislation now.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of the analogy I keep thinking about is the analogy of, say, a playground. So, you know, if children and young people have created a space that really should be a space of their own, a space for exploration, for risk taking, for enjoyment, and something goes wrong with that space, it becomes harmful to them, dangerous to them, et cetera, et cetera. It seems peculiar to me that our response as a society to that is we should ban them from the playground rather than think about how to make the playground safe, or who's rocked up in the playground, as we would say in Australia, and is causing trouble. You know, and so I think it's in some ways, and Australia is obviously not the only place thinking about banning young people from social media. It's a kind of profoundly unimaginative and regressive kind of move, because rather than recognize in a way that young people need spaces of their own, and these are potentially an important part of that mix for young people, to just kick them out of them without any effort to imagine something else, I think that's a concern. And so then I think in Australia, what we are holding our breath about is what kind of happens next? Like, where do young people go instead? They're so attuned to socializing online. They're so adaptable. They're so they have so much ingenuity. You know, what's going to happen after December 10? They're not all just going to turn their phones off and you know, go outside and kick a football, as the Prime Minister keeps saying. So I think we wait and see. And of course, also I think the very interesting thing playing out in Australia now is, you know, the government said, okay, we're going to implement the ban, and then technically how you go about banning under 16s from the internet actually turns out to be almost a comical kind of farce. It's an extremely difficult thing to do in practice. So it's a very interesting experiment. Yeah. Maybe one other thought about it is that I'm not I don't know, like if there's one thing I kind of admire, it's that the government is doing something, and something kind of brave. Like, they're saying to the tech industry, like, no, we will set our own rules. And so I think we're going to be careful. I think we've got to respect that part of it, you know, that it's better than governments just kind of what they have done for the last couple of decades and taken this, they're too big to regulate kind of. So I kind of like the fact, I like any government that's like, no, wait a second, we can do something here. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I also would like to applaud, at least, you know, this being a collective thing. Because as of now, it feels to me that we are increasingly putting responsibility, you know, on the level of the individuals, kind of letting kids run loose in the candy store, and kind of expecting that they would regulate and rule themselves, you know, instead of really focusing on the industry and imposing something there. I wonder how you feel about this. You know, should we demand more from the industrial side and put more responsibility on their shoulders?
That's what I think yeah, absolutely should be doing. Like, I think that the idea of the ban creating a sort of norm will be interesting for both, say, families, parents, young people, a kind of norm about whether we should and shouldn't be on these spaces. Like, I think that might create some interesting cultural changes over time. But I think recognizing that these industries are just extraordinarily profitable and have the resources to just better control and make their spaces safe, and are just kind of refusing to own up to that responsibility. I think we need to demand much more. And the kind of observatory approach that I'm part of here in Australia is to say we need to make digital platforms much more observable to
Mhm.
users, civil society, government, researchers, so that we can imagine ways that they ought to be more accountable. And so, that kind of institutions of observability, bringing in effect them back into the public, where they belong, so that we can all jointly have a stake in how they operate. And that's really going to require us to get better at placing demands on them. And I think governments are showing they have a little more appetite for that now, which is really encouraging, I think. I had my question for you. Well, I had two questions, but one was, when we think about gaming, the kind of gaming addiction or social media addiction, we're often thinking about like compulsive or obsessive kind of affects, and I'm just kind of interested in whether and what other kinds of affects or mood disorders or implications these technologies are having people beyond that kind of leap to kind of think about it in terms of like compulsive behaviors or addiction. I'm just interested in what the broader affective consequences of these forms of media might be in terms of what you're seeing in
Yeah.
your practice.
Yeah. I mean, I guess technology caters to these different individuals differently as well, right? Depending on which state
Right.
they are. And it's also quite shocking to know
Yeah.
that, as you pointed out in dark advertisement, they're also usually quite well informed, like about mental
Right.
disorders their clients have. Yeah, and also cater to that as well, which is another
Yeah.
shocking thing.
Yeah.
But one thing that I find particularly striking is that constant restlessness, that hyperarousal, that
Yeah. Yeah.
comes, I think, from screen usage. And there is a book, McGonagall wrote it, which she labeled "Reality is Broken." And basically, maybe you know it,
Mm.
her hypothesis is that reality is simply by now inferior to gaming environments, to social media environments, because it's not as appealing. It's tragic, it's difficult, it's complicated. And so,
Yeah.
I mean, I can follow her argument to this point, but she also says that as a consequence, we should gamify everything. So a gamification of reality in a way. And I find this line of reasoning difficult for many reasons, but it also
Mm.
seems to be, yeah, especially in young people, that this is sort of the expectation of life itself, right? That it should be gamified, that there's instant reward. You think, also this demand for fast responses, fast reactions, instant gratification, there's much less patience, I would say, and also
Yeah.
lack
Yeah.
tolerance. Yeah. In a way.
Yeah. I mean, I find it really interesting that the focus that you're drawing toward the hyper arousal, because for me that really tunes into something about the kind of intensity and flow of social media feeds now, and for us to kind of sit back and recognize that our social media feeds, our digital media feeds, have actually changed really dramatically over the last decade. They've become much faster in the way they flow, much more intense, and much more responsive to little things we do in them, the ways we dwell, like what videos we stop on for a moment longer than others. And it was really TikTok that was the created a new kind of algorithmic model that would really run not on who your social network was, but on your kind of pattern of swiping.
Mhm.
And the reason TikTok did that is because they needed to, their developers in China needed to create a model that would work in the West without them knowing anything about Western languages and cultures. So they just were working on the patterns alone. And like I think then, I mean, as you kind of indicated, like you get very strange things happen, that hyper arousal, but also like if you're sort of hyper aroused about your own mood and you stop on someone saying, do I have ADHD or do I have OCD? Then all of a sudden you'll be seeing hundreds of videos about that over the
Yeah.
coming days. you know,
Yeah.
and that you must see that kind of loop happen with people you're treating, right?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. But as I said, it has more like a pop psychology quality to
Right.
it. People coming in
Yeah.
with proclaimed diagnoses, and it has very little substance. Usually, if you probe further
Yeah.
and say, "What does it mean?" I don't understand, but they find it tedious. Usually, they're like, "ChatGPT understand.
Yeah.
Why do you ask?"
But it's like just something else to be aroused about and to be thinking about in terms of, before the feed, throw some other little intense flurry of something at you, and that's what arouses you for the next few days or something. Like, there's a really non-narrative, non-linear, chaotic pattern to a lot of what people are
Yeah.
experiencing in these feeds, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And yet, the industry is still trying to promote the technology, especially for neurodivergent children, which I find almost criminal. And I
Right.
just can't believe that tech companies get away with sentences like, yeah, we can use AI to train autistic kids social human empathy. I don't know. I don't think I would have survived a sentence like that in a paper, like justly so.
No,
But yeah, it's out there.
no.
I get asked that kind of questions.
Yeah, and I think this part of it is like a lot has changed very dramatically in the last decade, but it's clear in the last couple of years we're on the cusp now in the midst of another very dramatic change. And one way of understanding that, I think, is like we have lived through a kind of training period over a couple of decades where we've created enormous data sets of unstructured information about ourselves. And by that I mean like text and video and images, and it's trained models that in a way don't know much about us, but are very good at following the patterns of our interaction with each other. And that's those models have become the foundation models of everything we now call AI. And they're, as anyone who uses these models know, they're kind of idiotic. Like they can produce things, by proxy, and in some ways are kind of quite powerful, but in other ways are quite, you know, um, really they can tune into some of the ways we talk or some of the things we're interested in, but then know nothing about us at all. And so it's a kind of strange mode of interaction for people to be finding themselves caught up in, particularly as you say, where it's being given to people in a sort of almost like as if it's a therapeutic device of some kind.
Yeah, I agree.
I could listen to you both all day. And that's what people are saying in the chat. We've got about 7 minutes left, so I'd love to get a couple of questions in. We've got a few, and we probably won't get to them all. But what a rich and relevant discussion. Yeah, really powerful. One of the questions that's come in is to Dr. Makande. I hear that there are screening tools being developed for gaming, and probably we could open it up to just technology overall. Do you use a specific assessment or screening tool when working with youth, probably, or adults as well? And can you share anything? There's many of us that are working with folks, and I think adding screening in this way would definitely be something that we could add to our practice. So anything you could share on that specifically is of interest to the group.
Yeah, there's definitely, if you pop me an email, I can send you English versions because, by heart, I only know the German ones and they will be of very little use to you. But yeah, it's a very cost-effective, easy way to just screen for people coming in if you don't have the time to do interviews. But yeah, you're welcome to us. And I screen everybody on principle, just to be sure I don't miss anything for these things. I mean, we always do psychometric testing at the moment, and I don't see why it shouldn't include a media usage scale. And interestingly, I observed that I get quite defensive about it when I hand it out. You still feel kind of apologetic when you give it to people, but but I think it definitely makes sense. Sorry, Greg, I can't hear you. I think you mean.
Oh, yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. What we'll do is we'll have on our website and with the recording some links to some of those resources, and a link to the website is in the chat, and you can click on the link to find more. after the presentation and for those watching on the recording. Brilliant. Another question that came in, we see the precedent of banning phones in schools. Do you envision considerable global and governmental dialogue regarding civil liberties and human rights as people are adversely affected by AI and the impact of algorithms?
This is for Nick.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's sort of interesting about you might kind of think of the periods here in that, like I don't know, if you looked at the EU, one of the places in the world that has been most, I guess, adventurous or leading the way in terms of making regulation, where governments have sought to act. The first wave of concern really was about often framed in terms of privacy, like the privacy of people's personal information, the collection of it, knowing it's collected, knowing what it's used for. And then as data was being used to train big models to recommend content at us, it was like we kind of realized that, that wasn't the whole story. And so I think that the DSA, the Digital Services Act in Europe, is really trying to get at the question of often kind of how data is used to train models that then make decisions about us or recommend things to us, and what we ought to be able to understand in terms of effects on us as individuals, but also larger social effects. So, for me, say studying something like alcohol advertising, where do models learn that say someone, use a range of proxies to work out that say someone is a dependent drinker and then target them disproportionately? Like that's a harm. How do we contain it and respond to it? But I think then, we're now on the cusp of something else altogether, which is as people are not just sort of interacting with feeds of content that have been recommended to them, but are kind of interacting with these kind of AI agents, where they're having these sort of semi-social interactions with a model, or where the content in their feed is being tuned or produced by automated models. And just a whole bunch of questions come into view about really like risk and responsibility for what those models do and what they say to people and what they advise people to do. And we're also already seeing all sorts of kind of, I guess you would say uncontained harmful effects because there's just not enough guardrails in many of those models. So I think, it took us a long time to get through those first two phases. And here we are again having to scramble, I think.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Kara. And a final question for Dr. Makande. Could you tell us about excessive online gaming and any current findings that demonstrate harmful psychological outcomes?
Yeah, absolutely. So gaming is another one of my pet research topics. So I've done especially research into gaming and its links to cybercrime. And of course, we can say that there is such a thing as healthy recreational gaming, but the whole debate around gaming is becoming ever more polarized. Now I find myself on the other end of the spectrum somehow. But we really know that gaming, we know this from longitudinal data, significantly predicts all kinds of cyberdeviant behavior. So really in large longitudinal data, we found prediction for hacking, for cyberbullying, for online pornography consumption, for piracy as well. So it is really something I think that needs our attention, because a lot of gamers also engage in, something that we call modding, which is the modification of games through programming. And for many, it's sort of the gateway drug, to hacking activities, because these are clearly blurred lines. And this is also a very unregulated place, not least because of the affordances, because also game developers are always very keen on hitting that sweet spot, where the game is just challenging enough, but not frustrating and also not boring. And so caters to us, much more individually than say, a television would or a book would to that extent. So I'm also quite wary and skeptic of that. And we know that the effects of gaming on mental health are especially bad for neurodivergent people and children. So if you take anything from this talk, please, if you have a neurodivergent child, ADHD, or on the spectrum, please try to shield them as long as possible, because it will only make things worse.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been an extremely informative discussion for all of us as leaders. And, again, the recording will be available to GLE members. So please catch it there. If you haven't already, we encourage you to register for GLE. And we are now actually going to put a poll up and will be placed on your screen. So if you have a moment before you leave, could you please respond to the respond before the webinar closes? And I want to remind everyone that GLE supports a member country to host a 5-day leadership exchange every 2 years, and that our next leadership exchange is right here in Canada, June 1st to 5th. This is an event for GLE members, so please again join us. It is free to join, and you can see the chat links for more information as well. There's a link that's been added for your ease. And as we end our webinar today, I want to again thank our speakers as well as the team that made this possible, led by our very own Jenny Wolf, Addictions and Lived Experience Council lead. Thank you so much, Jenny, for everything you did to make this possible. And of course, my co-chair, Lindsay Fortune of our Addiction Collaborative, and then Mel and Chris behind the scenes that really ran the show and made it all possible. Thank you all, and I hope to see you here in Canada in June.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Paul.
Nick. I learned a
Thank
lot.
you. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Bye.
Thank you.